In this video, we're going to be covering the Application Designer. The Application Designer allows you to create mimics, then display them in a Windows environment. Before we begin, let's go over some of the differences between the Mimic Designer and the Application Designer. Unlike the Mimic Designer, the Application Designer stores projects in a .NET assembly instead of the data model, and also has extensive .NET code behind capabilities in both C# and Visual Basic. This allows you to create a high-performance set of screens at the expense of only being able to view them in a Windows client. Now let's open a project in the Application Designer. I'll do this by clicking the Open Project button in the top left. Then, I'll browse for a project called App Designer Project. Then click the Open button to open it in the Designer. Overall, the UI is very similar to the Mimic Designer, but there are some small differences. The first thing you'll notice is that the toolbar has some project-specific icons. Instead of opening single files like Mimics, you're going to be opening .NET projects. From here, you can also build the project, build then run the project, and save all the files in your project. The next noticeable difference is that you now have a project tab nested in the document tree area. This will show you all the files in your project. From here, you can add folders, new mimics, assembly references, and then files like images and videos to your project. Working with the designer surface in the Application Designer is very much like the Mimic Designer. You have all of the same tools you do in the Mimic Designer, and even a handful of controls that aren't available in the Mimic Designer. For example, if I look through the Items Control Toolbox group, we can see things like the Items Control, List View, Menus, and more. These controls aren't supported in the Mimic Designer due to the nature of how they work. If you're unfamiliar with the Mimic Designer, I'd recommend watching the training video we have, as it covers a lot of the shared technology between these applications. Now let's discuss the runtime. In the Application Designer, you can use the Test Run button to preview things like data bindings and other control functionality. You can see that we've got a data binding updating in the Designer surface area now. I can also launch the runtime within the Application Designer by clicking the Build and Run icon on the toolbar. This will open the runtime client so we can view our current mimic. Now, let's take a look at the configuration process for the application runtime. To do this, I'll need to open the Application Runtime Configuration utility we've created for this. The Startup tab is where you're going to configure what should be loaded when the runtime client first starts. The startup assembly is going to be the project that you've built. This is usually in the bin/debug folder inside the folder where your project is stored. I'll go ahead and browse for our project now and set it as the startup assembly. Now that we've chosen a startup assembly, we can choose a startup screen. In this dropdown, you'll see all of the screens that are available in the assembly you've chosen. When you've found the screen you want, you can simply select it from the list and it will be set as a screen that will be shown first. After that, you have the startup asset. When viewing template mimics, this will be the asset you want to view with your mimic. If you're not using mimic templates, then you can leave this option blank. Templated mimics will be covered in another video. Below that, you can set an optional window title to the text of your choosing. The next set of options control the window size. As you can see, they're currently disabled. This is because the Is Full Screen Enabled option is checked. If this is set, the client will launch in full screen window mode, which will hide things like the title bar so you'll only see the screen. If I uncheck this option, I can then edit these properties. The first one listed is the window style. This allows you to set how the window will behave, and each option will display a different look. Below that, you have options to set the width and height of the window, and then a window position. As I mentioned, Is Full Screen Enabled allows you to make the client full screen when it's launched. The next two options are Stretch Background and Auto Size. The Stretch Background option will stretch the background of your Mimic to help fill any blank spaces that may occur, while the Auto Size option will scale your Mimic to fill the client window if your Mimic isn't the same size. Finally, the last option gives you the ability to disable the Windows key and Alt-Tab functionality, which will lock the user into the client. This is especially helpful if you've designed a Mimic for something like a terminal or a kiosk. When you've got your settings the way you want them, you can click the Save As button to save your configuration file, which I'll do now. This will bring up a dialog where you can choose your configuration file location. In my case, I'll save this on the desktop and use the default file name of status client config. If everything goes smoothly, you'll get a message that tells you the file has been saved, and then you're ready to open the runtime. I'll go ahead and minimize the configuration utility, then open my Start menu and find the application runtime so I can launch it. Next, I'll enter my login information and click Connect. We're now looking at the dialog where you can choose your configuration file to open. So I'm going to click the button and then browse to my desktop for the configuration we just created. I'll select it, then click Continue to launch the client. And here we have our screen that we chose in our configuration file loaded in the application runtime. You can also schedule screens to be displayed at various intervals in the application runtime. In the configuration utility, there's a tab called Scheduler that you can use to do this. By default, this is disabled when using the Startup tab. To enable it, first click on the checkmark labeled Use a Scheduler. The box next to the scheduler checkmark sets a default time period for which each screen should be displayed. This can be changed to any length that you need. Next, we need to add some screens to our list. This can be done by clicking the button with the plus sign in it. The first option is the assembly. This will be the DLL file that the application designer created when you built your project. When you click on this button, it will open a dialog you can use to browse for your file. In my case, my project is saved in my documents, so I'm going to navigate into the Documents folder, then find App Designer Project, go into the Bin Debug folder, and select the App Designer Project DLL and click Open. You'll notice that when we selected this DLL, one of the screens from our project has been populated in the second option, which is the screen. We can change this by expanding the dropdown to see all of the screens we have in our project. If you're happy with what it shows, then you can just leave this as is. In my case though, I want to see the main page as the first screen, so I'll choose that one from the list. The next option is the path. If you're planning on adding templated documents into your scheduled rotation, this is where you'd set the asset you want to view when the screen is loaded. If you're using regular mimics, then you don't need to set this parameter. After that, you have the duration. As I mentioned earlier, Each screen has a duration as to how long it will be displayed. Here it's possible for you to set different durations for the screens in your schedule if you don't want them to display for the same periods of time. Finally, we have the cache option. When enabled, you can cache the content of the page so that the data is preserved and loaded with the screen when it's viewed again. If you don't need to cache your pages, you can leave this unchecked. Now that we have this screen added, let's add at least one more since this schedule wouldn't be very useful if there was only one screen in it. I'll go ahead and add this other screen into our schedule using the same settings that we did for the previous one. While I'm at it, I'll quickly change the duration for each of these screens to 2 seconds. That way we'll be able to see them change without having to sit and stare at the screen. I'll also cache these pages so they load fast for us. Once you're happy with your schedule, you can save it by clicking on the Save As button. This will open a dialog where you can browse for a location to save your configuration file. In my case, I'll go ahead and overwrite the configuration I made earlier. Now we're ready to test this in our client. At this point, I'm going to open the Start menu and find the application runtime and then open it. I'll then click the Connect button and wait for it to log in. Next, I'll browse for the configuration that we made on the desktop, select it, and click Open. Now, when I click Connect, you'll see that we have our screen cycling through our client. We've now gone through the process of using the Application Designer and the Application Runtime. In closing, Status Enterprise is a powerful, easy-to-use tool that lets you design once and deploy multiple times. For more information on Status Enterprise and the Application Designer, please visit us on the web at www.scada.com.